Well, hello, and welcome to this weekly check-in. My name is Dennis Sanders, and I am the pastor at First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ of St. Paul, located in Roseville, Minnesota. So this week, I want to talk to you about evangelism. And I want to start with a story from about 20 years ago. It's hard to believe it's already 20 years ago. I was actually out in South Minneapolis, and I was handing out campaign literature. I was helping out a local campaign. And I was walking past this church in the neighborhood when I saw this other man that was coming my way. He had this really kind of strange look on his face with this really kind of freaky kind of grin, and told me something was not right. And I was really, really hoping that he was just going to kind of pass me by, maybe even just quietly say hello, but that was about it. And he did, and then he kind of turned around and he started to talk to me. Right away, he told me that he was a Christian and that he wanted to share the gospel with me. Well, I mean, he said it was the gospel, but as you will find out in this whole conversation, it really didn't live up to that word, or at least the word in how I interpret what it means. He asked if I was a Christian, and I told him, yes, I was. And I really hoped that this was going to be the end of the conversation. I was like, oh, well, great, fine. And then he would walk off on his merry way. But no, that didn't happen. Then he had to ask what the congregation that I belonged to, what was their stance when it came to homosexuality. Oh boy. So I told him the truth. I told him that my congregation had people had various differing opinions when it came to homosexuality. We all kind of worshiped together, we came together. In some ways, that's a hallmark of who we are as disciples, but we had differing views. Well, that wasn't good enough for him. For him, if a church was open to gays, then that meant that they weren't really Christians, and then I wasn't really a Christian. And he kept ranting more and more about being gay. And finally, he says something that was incredibly over the top, and I basically just turned around and walked away. All the while, he's just kind of yelling this kind of gibberish at me. And I was just totally incredibly upset by the whole experience. Now, many people, especially in the mainline church, which the disciples are a part of, tend to look down on evangelism. And if you look at my experience, you could probably understand why. Some of the disgust when it comes to evangelism is justified. Historically, sometimes people have used this way of talking about the good news, which is what evangelism is all about, to manipulate people or to hurt people. It hasn't always been used in the right way. But unfortunately, sometimes we get the wrong message. The message that we get then is to think that evangelism in and of itself is bad. And that's not really true. I don't think that this guy really understood what evangelism was all about. Evangelism simply means telling the good news. Evangel, that word actually means good news. That's also where the word gospel comes from. And it talks about the good news of Jesus. And telling people about Jesus isn't about being pushy, but it is about sharing what God has done in your life and sharing that with someone that you know. In the first chapter of the book of John, Jesus is passing by and he sees his cousin, John the Baptist, and John the Baptist decides to tell his disciples that this is Jesus, the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world. And he tells them about this experience he had when he baptized Jesus, of a dove coming down and this voice from heaven. And he tells them that Jesus, his cousin, is the Son of God. And the next day, Jesus is passing by again. John does the same thing. But this time, two of his disciples decide to follow Jesus. They ran up to Jesus and asked where he's staying, which actually meant where did he belong? Where did he abide? Jesus never gives them really an answer, but he just says, come and see. And so they spend the evening basically with Jesus. They're chatting with him, talking about him. And then they go and they tell their brothers. Andrew tells his brother Peter, and Philip tells his brother, and Nathaniel. And the word about Jesus just keeps spreading and spreading. Now, we in the church, as I've said, have done a bad job when it comes to evangelism. On the one hand, there are people like this man who, sometimes try to force people or scare people into into knowing about Jesus, and that's not the way. God is revealed in Jesus Christ, and Jesus, when he was on earth, didn't try to force people to get to know about Jesus, about him. He just simply shared and talked to them and listened to them. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is actually a few chapters later in the book of John, and that is the story of the woman at the well. Jesus is in Samaria, and he is sitting down. It's around noon, and this woman comes up. This woman, we think, might have been an outsider. We don't know much about her, but she's drawing water at a time of the day that you don't normally draw water. And Jesus engages with her. And she basically becomes a messenger. She tells the people in her village about Jesus because Jesus has connected with her. And she is able to spread the good news. This person that was an outsider, all of a sudden, is one that is invited to spread the gospel. Jesus didn't shame her. He didn't have a canned speech. He didn't try to force her to know about him. He simply shared his life with her. And that's what we are called to do. Especially here at First Christian, but whatever church that you belong to, if you're listening, there are many people in our culture, in our world today, that really desperately need to hear the word that God loves them, especially those who are LGBTQ. People have been long told that God doesn't love them, especially if they are gay or lesbian. And they need to know that. And what would happen if we shared the good news with our friends and our neighbors? And sharing that by sharing what God has done in our lives. What if we told them that they were loved by God? Thankfully, that horrible experience from 2 decades ago hasn't made me sour on telling the good news, because it's important, it's vital. That gentleman wasn't sharing the good news. He may have thought he was, but he wasn't. But I do know that there is good news in Jesus Christ. And I've heard it time and time again from family and from friends. So my message to you is, let us go and tell the good news of Jesus Christ by sharing what's going on in our own lives. It's news that we cannot and should not ever keep to ourselves. Take care, dear church. Have a good week, and Godspeed.